Cheapside, City of London, 6:15 in the evening, 29th of December 1940. Sub-Officer Frank Eldridge, Composite Auxiliary Fire Service, 7 months towing a trailer pump behind a requisitioned taxi out of a substation off Cheapside, was not looking at the sky when the first incendiaries came down. He was looking at the river. He had heard, an hour before the sirens, that the Thames was at one of the lowest ebbs anyone at the substation could remember for the date. That was not weather, that was tide table, and a fire crew relying on suction from the river at low tide, in a district where half the static water points ran off Thames-fed mains, was a fire crew that might reach a hydrant and find mud. The first bombs were not high explosive. They came down in their hundreds, then their thousands. Small, 1-kilogram incendiary canisters, the kind that did nothing on their own except burn where they landed, unless nobody reached them in time. Eldridge's crew had trained for exactly this. Get to the bomb before it became a fire. Smother it. Move to the next. What the training had not covered was what happened when 100,000 of them came down in 3.5 hours over a square mile of livery halls, churches, and paper warehouses built of timber floors and close-set masonry, on the one night the river could not be relied on to help put any of it out. By 6:30, Eldridge's taxi and trailer pump were one of perhaps a dozen AFS units converging on the same half-mile of streets north of St. Paul's, each one carrying the same unspoken calculation: how many fires can we reach before the water runs out, and which ones do we leave? The AFS trailer pump Eldridge's crew towed behind their taxi was not a purpose-built fire engine. It was a Home Office issue pump on a 2-wheeled chassis, delivered without a towing vehicle attached, because in 1938 nobody had budgeted for one. London's answer, worked out in the 18 months before war broke out, was to requisition roughly 2,000 of the capital's own taxis, mostly Austins, chosen because their 6-cylinder engines could tow, their luggage compartments could carry hose, and their roofs could take a ladder. A crew of 5 or 6 rode where the passengers used to sit. What the combination could deliver was straightforward and limited. 1 pump, 1 crew, 1 length of hose reaching as far as the taxi could park from the fire, and the hydrant could feed it. What it could not deliver was volume. A single trailer pump on a warehouse fire in the publishing district was not going to hold a building alight from roof to ground floor. It was going to hold a doorway, or a stairwell, or buy the next crew 90 seconds. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing to British Old Fire Brigades. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the British Fire Brigade between 1900 and 1980. The appliance, the building, the knowledge the crew had built from previous call-outs, and the community that depended on that knowledge before smoke detectors and sprinklers changed what fire could do before a crew arrived. Not spectacle. The documented operational reality of a fire brigade that fought the Second Great Fire of London with taxis towing trailer pumps because nobody had built anything better in time. Sub-Officer Eldridge's 7 months of towing a trailer pump behind a City of London taxi had taught him what the manual issued to every AFS volunteer in 1938 had not, and none of it was written down before the National Fire Service replaced the AFS in August 1941. And if you served in the fire brigade in this era, or your family did, put it in the comments. If you had family in the Auxiliary Fire Service, the London Fire Brigade, or the St. Paul's Watch during the Blitz, which station, which division, and do you know what they were called out to on the night of 29th of December 1940? The next video follows what happened to the Auxiliary Fire Service crews of this night 8 months later, when the National Fire Service absorbed them into a single command they had not trained for, back at the trailer pump. The watch system that put Eldridge and his crew on that street corner was the same one the peacetime London Fire Brigade had run for decades. Rotating shifts, a station kept permanently crewed, a division each watch came to know by its streets and its buildings. Except that in December 1940, the AFS had layered 28,000 volunteers on top of the brigade's 2,500 professionals, most of them with under 2 years of experience between call-outs that came, that winter, almost every night. What told Eldridge, 90 minutes in, that this was not a night his crew's single trailer pump could manage on its own was not the number of fires. It was what the buildings around him were built from. The square mile the raid was falling on was not residential streets of brick terraces that fire moved through slowly, room by room. It was livery halls, city churches, and publishing warehouses, Georgian and Victorian masonry construction with timber floors, timber roof structures, and, in the case of Paternoster Row's booksellers, buildings packed floor to ceiling with paper. Paper did not smoulder the way damp terrace timber did. It went up, and it went up fast, and it produced a fire that consumed oxygen and generated heat at a rate a single hose line was never built to counter. And the water that should have countered it was not there in the volume it needed to be. The Thames was at one of the lowest ebbs of the year, which meant river suction points that normally gave a crew an almost unlimited supply were giving them mud and a struggling low-pressure trickle. Worse, a main had ruptured early in the raid. Nobody could yet say from which bomb, and every hydrant drawing from that section of pipe was losing pressure as more crews opened more valves onto the same shrinking supply. Eldridge had trained to fight a fire with a full head of pressure behind his branch. What the square mile was teaching him, block by block, was how to fight one without it, which hydrant to abandon before it was worth arguing over, which building was already lost and not worth the water, which building was still worth the water because the crew that held it might stop the fire from crossing the street to the next one. Half a mile from where Eldridge's crew was rationing water between two burning warehouses, a different kind of fire problem was being managed on the roof of St. Paul's Cathedral, and it had nothing to do with pump pressure. Winston Churchill had given an instruction, weeks before, that was blunt and specific. St. Paul's was to be saved, whatever the cost. The instruction had produced the St. Paul's Watch, a volunteer firewatch team, architects and clergy and building surveyors among them, trained to move across the cathedral's roofs, galleries and dome with a knowledge of the building's structure that no outside crew could match on arrival. Watch member George Garwood took the first warning call shortly after 6 o'clock. The sound, as one account of the night describes it, of a scuttle of coals being spilled across a floor above him, which was in fact incendiary bombs striking the roof. 28 fell on and around the cathedral that night. 27 were reached and dealt with by hand before they did structural damage. The 28th burned through the lead sheathing of the dome itself and lodged against the wooden supporting structure beneath. The point at which, if it had caught, the watch's own accounts describe the fire reaching timber the cathedral could not have survived losing. It fell outward before it fully ignited, landing on the stone gallery, where it was extinguished. What the St. Paul's Watch had that Eldridge's crew did not was not more water. It was more specific knowledge. Years, in some cases, of walking the same roof spaces, knowing which lead sheets covered which timbers, knowing where a man could stand and where he could not. Two different kinds of expertise were operating in the city that night. The trailer pump crew's knowledge of which hydrant still had pressure, and the watch's knowledge of one building's structure, learned before the war and applied under fire with nobody able to teach it to them in the moment. Not every AFS volunteer working the city that night carried only a hose. Leonard Rosoman, an auxiliary fireman off Fleet Street, was also a painter, though nobody on his crew was thinking about that at 9:30 as they worked a burning Victorian book warehouse on Shoe Lane, close enough to Paternoster Row that the same paper-fed fire behavior Eldridge's crew was fighting half a mile away was governing what Rosoman's crew could and could not do. Rosoman had been holding a position at the base of a wall when he was relieved by another fireman, a routine changeover, the kind that happened dozens of times a shift as crews rotated to rest, to reposition, to let a fresh pair of hands take the branch. He stepped back. Seconds later, the wall came down. The fireman who had just taken Rosoman's place was killed. The man beside him, fellow auxiliary fireman William Sansom, who would later write about the Blitz as a novelist, was under the same collapse and survived. Rosoman did not write an incident report about what he had seen. He painted it, months later, and called it the falling wall. He was, by his own account in later life, never satisfied with the result. He thought it too literal, too direct a transcription of a memory he could not otherwise put down. It was exhibited at the Fireman Artists Exhibition at the Royal Academy in 1941, alongside work by other AFS volunteers who had also picked up a brush between call-outs because the AFS had recruited from every part of London's working and creative life, and put all of it in identical uniform, on identical trailer pumps, in front of the identical wall that did not care what any of them had been before December 1940. The square mile was not a residential district, and that fact shaped what the fire brigade was protecting and who was still inside when the bombs began to fall. By 6:30 on a Sunday evening, most of the city's ordinary daytime population, clerks, printers, warehousemen, the tens of thousands who filled its offices on a working day, had gone home to the suburbs hours before. What remained were the people whose job it was to be there after the day ended: night watchmen at the livery halls and warehouses, fire watch volunteers posted on rooftops across dozens of buildings under wartime regulation, skeleton staff at telephone exchanges and newspaper offices that ran through the night regardless of what fell on the city around them. For a night watchman at a Paternoster Row warehouse, the fire brigade arriving was not an abstraction. It was the difference between a building he was responsible for surviving the night and a building that did not. For the volunteer fire watchers posted on city rooftops under the same regulations that had put the St. Paul's watch on the cathedral, every incendiary that landed near them was a problem they were expected to handle themselves, with a bucket and a stirrup pump, before it became a problem that needed Eldridge's trailer pump at all. The watch principle scaled down from one cathedral to hundreds of ordinary commercial buildings across the city. What burned that night was not simply property. It was the accumulated material of trades that had operated from these streets for centuries. Livery company records, church registers, the stock of publishers who could not simply reorder what Paternoster Row held. The 5 million books lost in the district were not an abstraction to the people who had spent that Sunday evening, before the sirens, doing the ordinary work of a city that did not yet know how much of itself would not be there by morning. By 4 in the morning, the worst of the raid was over. Later reports would note it had run from around 6:15 the previous evening to roughly that hour, though isolated fires among the ruins would keep burning for days. Eldridge's crew, and the dozens like it working the same half-mile, had held some buildings and lost others. What was left standing when the light came up on 30th of December told its own story about which kind of building the raid's fires had been able to consume and which they had not. 19 city churches were gone, 8 of them buildings Christopher Wren had designed after the first Great Fire of London, in 1666. The coincidence of a second fire consuming what the first had prompted was not lost on anyone reporting the raid that week. 31 livery halls, the ceremonial and administrative homes of London's ancient trade guilds, had burned. The publishing district around Paternoster Row was largely gone, and with it an estimated 5 million books, stock that could not be reordered, in some cases editions that no longer existed anywhere else. More than 160 people were killed across London that night, and in the days that followed, with roughly 250 injured, figures smaller than some of the raids that had come before in the autumn of 1940, because the target that night was deliberately the non-residential square mile rather than housing, but figures that were not abstractions to the night watchmen, the fire watch volunteers, and the AFS crews who had been working inside the fires those numbers describe. An American correspondent, cabling the story to his office that night, called it the Second Great Fire of London, a comparison to 1666 that was not exaggeration. Contemporary assessment held that the area burned exceeded what the original Great Fire had consumed. Eldridge's crew did not know the historical comparison being drawn about their night while they were still working it. They knew which streets they had held and which they had not, and they would not fully understand what either had meant until the light came up. Eldridge's trailer pump and requisition taxi kept working through the winter and spring that followed. There were more raids before the Blitz eased in May 1941, though none matched the scale of 29 to 30 December in the city specifically. What changed 8 months after the Second Great Fire of London was the organisation around him. On 18th of August 1941, the government amalgamated the Auxiliary Fire Service, the London Fire Brigade, and some 1,600 other local authority brigades across the country into a single national fire service. The AFS crews who had spent the winter learning, street by street, which taxi could reach which hydrant before the water ran out, which building was worth defending and which was not, were absorbed into a national command structure built for standardization rather than for the specific, hard-won local knowledge that had gotten them through December. The trailer pump itself did not disappear immediately. It remained in NFS service for years, now increasingly towed by purpose-built Austin K2 auxiliary towing vehicles rather than requisitioned taxis, the first of which reached service in the spring of 1941, just before the reorganization. What the NFS did change was who Eldridge answered to, how his crew was mixed with others from outside the city he had spent a year learning, and how much of the specific, informal knowledge his crew had built about the square miles water supply and building stock traveled with the reorganization and how much did not. None of what Eldridge's crew had learned about the Thames at low tide, about which hydrants lost pressure first when a main ruptured near Cheapside, about how fast a paper warehouse fire outran a single hose line, was written into an NFS training manual. It had been learned the way the St. Paul's Watch's knowledge of the cathedral roof had been learned, by being there, under the specific conditions of one night, and carried afterward only in the people who had been present for it. The last of the square miles bomb-damaged sites were not fully cleared and rebuilt for decades. Some of the churches destroyed on 29th of December 1940 were restored, others were left as ruins or gardens, a deliberate decision about what a city keeps as memory and what it rebuilds as function. The Guildhall, badly damaged that night, was restored. Not every livery hall was. If this channel is going to keep documenting what British firefighters knew about the buildings they entered and what that knowledge cost to acquire, subscribe. There are more appliances, more divisions, more watch systems, more taxis towing trailer pumps through streets that a hydrant relay could no longer serve, and more decisions made in the 90 seconds between arriving at a fire and choosing which building to save that were never written down anywhere. Sub-Officer Eldridge's 7 months of towing a trailer pump behind a City of London taxi had taught him what the manual issued to every AFS volunteer in 1938 had not, and none of it was written down before the National Fire Service replaced the AFS in August 1941. And if you have an incident, a station, a watch, a building, put it in the comments. If you had family in the Auxiliary Fire Service, the London Fire Brigade, or the St. Paul's Watch during the Blitz, which station, which division, and do you know what they were called out to on the night of 29th of December 1940? The next video follows what happened to the Auxiliary Fire Service crews of this night 8 months later, when the National Fire Service absorbed them into a single command they had not trained for. The National Fire Service was itself stood down in 1948, handed back to reformed local authority brigades, a second reorganization the men and women of the wartime AFS had not asked for either. Leonard Rosoman went on to become an official war artist in 1945. William Sansom became a published novelist, writing about the war he had fought as an auxiliary fireman. What happened to the fireman who took Rosoman's place at the wall and did not step back in time is recorded nowhere by name in the sources this script draws on. What the Second Great Fire of London gave the people who fought it, a specific, hard, local knowledge of how a paper-fed fire moved through Georgian and Victorian masonry at low tide with a burst main, reducing every hydrant's pressure at once. What it did not give them, a way to pass that knowledge forward. The AFS was dissolved into the NFS 8 months later. The NFS was dissolved into reformed local brigades 7 years after that. The taxis went back to being taxis, or were scrapped. The trailer pumps went into service elsewhere, disconnected from the crews who had learned, one burst main and one low tide at a time, exactly what each of them could and could not do. Nobody had asked Eldridge's crew, or the St. Paul's Watch, or Rosoman's crew at Shoe Lane what they knew before moving them somewhere else. The knowledge went where the people went. Most of it went nowhere anyone wrote down.